Text and manuscript thing,
Okay. My name's Ian Gregory, and slightly embarrassingly to admit in front of this audience, I know almost nothing about English literature. The expertise on that is all provided by David Cooper in what I'm going to talk about. My background's actually in geography, and particularly in GIS, Geographical Information Systems. What a GIS is, I'll explain what it is and then explain why it's relevant in a minute. Traditionally, a GIS started with a database table that looks something like this. That would usually be full of numbers on fairly depressing topics like death or crime or whatever. And what would make a GIS different would be that within it, each row of data down the bottom would be linked to a location on a map. So for instance, you can see Lancaster's highlighted here, and it's also highlighted up here. So you could either click on the map and ask what is at this location, or alternatively, you could use values down in the data to shade your map in. And what I want to try and talk about in the next few minutes is why this kind of rather crude structure that came out of the earth sciences and the social sciences has a relevance to literary studies and other areas within the humanities. To begin to answer that, a few years ago I got a pilot project from the British Academy with David and Sally Bushell at Lancaster, where the aim was to take a couple of texts of early tours of the Lake District, Thomas Gray's 1769 tour and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's 1802 tour, and to try and turn them into a GIS, and more importantly to then ask, well, what new knowledge can we get by doing this? Firstly, how do we turn a text into a GIS? It's actually not that difficult. This is Coleridge's tour, and you can see that as we work through, what we've done is we've tagged the place name. They're in these so-called XML tags, so Prospect Bridge, Portinscale, Newlands, etc. are held within tags that identifies them as place names. In this pilot project, we did that manually, which is slow but accurate, but more recently we've been doing it in automated ways, which is far quicker and far less accurate. Perhaps not surprisingly, but that's computing for you. Once you've got the place names, it's actually not very difficult from there. You can pull them all out into a database table. You can link them up to a so-called gazetteer. What gazetteer does is it gives you place names, but it also gives you coordinates for those place names. This is the Ordnance Survey's 1 in 50,000 gazetteer, which gives national grid coordinates for every place named on the Ordnance Survey's 1 in 50,000 map series. So you link the two together, which, as long as the spellings are identical, is really straightforward, and when they're not, just takes a little bit of messing about. And that gives you a coordinate for every place name. And once you've got that, turning that into something that looks a bit like a GIS is quite straightforward. This is a map of the two tours. I should say that the circles shaded in solid are places that the writer actually visited. The unshaded circles are places they're talking about without visiting. So Gray starts in Brough over here, heads down to Penrith, where he spends a couple of nights, travels down to Ullswater from there, then travels across to Keswick, where he spent a number of nights, and during the day travelled down to places like Borrowdale and up to Bathenswaite and so on. Then after a few days there, he travelled down the centre of the Lake District over Dunmail Raise, came down to Kendal in the end, spent a couple of nights there, came down to Lancaster, and at that point we leave his account. Coleridge, by contrast, lived in Keswick at the time. He travelled down through the Newlands Valley and over onto the coastal plain of Cumbria, where he spent, or what's now Cumbria, where he spent 2 or 3 days. Wandering around in a fairly aimless kind of way, back into what's now the National Park up Wasdale, climbed Scafell, which is what his account's famous for, got back down again, only just, and then toured around the southern part of the Lake District before he went up again over Dunmail Raise, heading in the opposite direction back home. So we can actually map the things. It's not particularly difficult. But what do you do with it once you've done that? Well, there's 2 different directions you can go in. The first is a kind of direction that I'm keen on. It's almost a social sciencey kind of direction, which says, well, how can we go beyond that? How can we be a bit more analytic about that? These sorts of maps are actually notoriously difficult to understand. The human eye doesn't like them very much. And there's a technique developed in particularly things like crime mapping and disease mapping, which attempts to simplify them. It's called density smoothing, and if I get the right controller, This is what the two different tours look like if you density smooth them. Basically, it's asking how many locations, events, things that are mentioned, in this case, places that are mentioned, are occurring near each location. And you can see what stands out from this is, with Gray, he's very much talking in particular about the area around Keswick. There's also clusters in and around Ullswater, perhaps around Kendal and down near Lancaster as well. Whereas with Coleridge, very much the centre of the places he's naming particularly is in and around Scafell, and that comes across very strongly from this sort of mapping. We can get a bit more analytic than that and start actually comparing those two patterns. These are two maps which, this is all places mentioned by both writers, and this is just places they're actually visiting. But the methodology is the same. The areas shaded in dark green are areas that are just talked about by Gray. Areas in dark red are areas that are just talked about by Coleridge. And these kind of in-between colours, the light greens, light reds, yellows, are places they're both talking about. And it's really striking from that although they're both Lake District writers, they're almost talking about completely separate areas. They only intersect a little bit around Keswick, which is only because Coleridge actually lived there, and kind of over Dunmail Raise and areas like that as well, which neither of them talk about particularly much. So what comes across very strongly is, although they're both talking about the same place at one level, they're actually talking about quite different places within that. We also got interested in how we could map emotional response. That's what these maps are trying to do. Basically, we allocated a numeric scale to the adjectives that we're using to describe places, from kind of 1s and 2s, which are dulls and drearies, all the way up to 9s and 10s, which are sublimes and terrifyings and things like that. What you get on this is actually quite a noticeably different pattern. It's very clear from this that Gray is the place he really respond to is Derwentwater and Borrowdale, but also Ullswater too. And with Coleridge, perhaps not surprisingly, he's particularly keen on Scafell. That comes across very strongly. But again, the Newlands Valley and areas around there come across quite well in that sort of representation from them. Another thing you can do with GIS is, because everything's got a coordinate associated with it, you can integrate it with almost any other data set that's also coordinate based. One example of that is a so-called terrain model, a digital terrain model, which gives effectively splits the landscape into small grid squares, each of which has got a height. The Ordnance Survey will provide them. And from there we were able to allocate heights to every place mentioned in the two tours. This is Gray's, the heights of places Gray visited. In blue are the places he actually visited. In red are places he's talking about from a distance. There's really quite a striking pattern to it. Perhaps what you'd expect maybe from a writer associated with the picturesque. He spends almost all of his time visiting very low areas. He basically doesn't get above 1,000 feet. But the areas he talks about without visiting are either these similar very low areas near where he's talking about, or effectively the high peaks, areas over about 2,000 feet. He almost completely ignores places in between, these in-between heights between about 1,000 and 2,000 feet. Coleridge is both interesting in the contrast and also the similarities to it, because he actually, although he's famous for climbing Scafell, he actually spends a lot of time talking about quite low places too. But the interesting thing about him is he goes all the way across the height range. It's like he wants to consciously identify places of all sorts of heights and descriptions. We also did this with population data, but I don't want to dwell on that because it's fairly predictable that Gray visited places that tended to have quite high populations, whereas Coleridge is almost consciously avoiding them. So that's all very well. That's all well and good. But what we've kind of done here is we've started with two texts, and we've abstracted them up to what we call spatial data in the trade, and then started to analyse that spatial data, but we've almost completely left the text behind. And I'm assured by people that know more about this than me that that's not in the best traditions of English literature. So, can we, rather than going down this approach, an alternative approach is then to ask the question, well, can we, rather than almost replacing the text with the map-based data, can we just use map-based data to enhance the text instead, or in this case, enhance the manuscript? And that's what this is trying to do. We've been through several iterations of this, which is why there's several URLs down there. This is actually something that we put together just for this meeting, based on Gurney's expedition to Helvellyn. And what we've got is there's a Google map up here. with the locations of all the places that are talked about within the text marked up there. We've got the text itself down here with the locations highlighted, and over here we've got the manuscript that text is taken from. Which, for those of you that are interested in this sort of thing, that's actually sitting on a server at the Wordsworth Trust, whereas the rest of it's on a server at Lancaster. So actually using these spatial technologies actually allows you to what's called mash up material, which means bringing together material from different sources. So what you can do with this is, if you wanted to just read along in the normal kind of way down here, you can move from page to page. And carry on through. And then you may spot a place that you're interested in, or maybe you're interested in every place you come across. But for instance, there's a place called Capel Cave there, which point you probably haven't heard of that, which poses a question, well, where is that? So if you click on one of these places on the text here, it will actually take you on the map to where that place is. It's actually just north of Helvellyn. So in that way, the map is, if you like, trying to complement what you're reading, trying to help you understand the geographies behind what you're reading. But you can also approach this from, if you like, a map-centric point of view as well as from the text. So if you're interested in what the point just below that is, you could then click on that, and up in this window here, it tells you, it's not only tells you it's Helvellyn, it also gives what linguists call the keyword in context, the text immediately surrounding each mention of Helvellyn in that particular text. Or if you wanted to, and as we've done for on other versions of this, it could be all of the mentions in a large corpus of literature, so Gray, Coleridge, Wordsworth, etc., etc., etc. But in this case, we've just got Gurney there. But in that case, if you click on one of the references that you might decide you're interested in, it will then take you to the text and the manuscript where that location occurs. So in that way, we've got a new way of looking at the text that enhances it through map-based data rather than replacing the text with map-based data. And those two different approaches, I think, can work together rather than being in competition with each other. So where are we go? I'll just skip over that. Where are we going with that? Well, that was a pilot project that we had a couple of years ago, which I think proved that we could do useful things with text and literature within GIS. More recently, we've just started working on an ERC, European Research Council funded project, 5-year project where we're planning to take that an awful lot further. What we're going to do is create a major corpus of Lake District writing from about the 1750s up to about 1900. Develop better techniques for analysing the text using both automated techniques and what are called scholarly techniques, more traditional techniques here. I think the big challenge with this sort of thing, as I've kind of hinted at so far, is how you bring together the IT-based number crunching, chuck it all in and see what drops out kind of approaches to the more traditional scholarly kind of approaches. I don't think the two are in competition. I think the two need to complement each other. We also want to add additional material from Web 2.0 sites like Flickr on how people are representing this landscape today and how that compares with writing in the past. There's also a large historical element in this as well as a literary element, but I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm also running a number of training courses and expert meetings to, in EU parlance, help develop the skills base. So in that way, we hope to develop the use of GIS within literature quite significantly further forward from where we are today. And if you want to see anything more about the project, that's the URL for it. Thank you very much.